So basically, the reason I have this is to explain how I came to the point of having a show about nothing. But to start off, my name's Amber. Thank you guys all for coming. I have been painting, just like a little background, I've been painting pretty much my whole life. I started when I was really young. My mom is an artist as well, so she always had just art supplies just all over the house. And when I was growing up, she would just give me extra supplies that she's had and just said, here, make things, do things. Which was really beneficial for me. I didn't even realize how much I appreciated it until like years later when I was in my 20s. I kind of was going through a hard time, and I went back to this familiar thing just as a way to express myself, I guess, and to just work through some complicated emotions. It helped me deal with anxiety issues that I had, still have, and yeah, and basically I think I picked up a paintbrush again when I was like around 22, and then slowly things started to pick up steam, and over time I just kept doing it, and each year I would paint more and more. I grabbed random just supplies. I worked at restaurants, and I would just take like huge empty boxes and cut them open and lay them on the floor in my basement and just paint. And it just was really natural for me. It just is sort of has always felt like a piece of home, I guess, when I've been away from home. And so anyway, I did that for years. I just would paint whatever I was feeling, whatever I was working through mentally or emotionally. And it wasn't until actually this year that I came across this whole movement of art that came, years before me in the 40s and 50s, the abstract expressionist movement. I just never heard of it before, which is crazy because, I never had formal art education. I went to school for creative writing, and then I dropped out and worked different jobs. And it was crazy to me when I came across all of this, because it was this thing that was always so natural to me. It was, when I was in high school, I took drawing classes and photography classes and things like that, but I hated it, basically. I enjoyed it, but it was just really frustrating trying to do anything that was realistic in any capacity. It basically just made me more frustrated than I was, trying to use it as an outlet. So I came up with my own way of doing things using different tools. Sometimes paintbrushes, mostly things like squeegees or random supplies you can get at a hardware store, things like that. And so then when I just randomly came across this whole movement of artists, it blew me away. I was like, what? This is so familiar to me. It was like I went into history and found old friends or something, And I started reading about these artists and their lives, and what inspired them, and the way they looked at, I guess the way they approached their work. And it just blew me away. It was like a light got turned on inside of me, because I was like, even though I know people do this today, I didn't know what the origins of it were, I guess, sort of in our country, in terms of what is sort of celebrated within art history and discussed within art history. And so coming across all these artists, I was just like, it was just really fascinating. And I found this book. It's called 9th Street Women. I meant to bring it with me tonight because it had all these really great quotes I was going to read, but of course I left it at home. But it's called 9th Street Women. It's by this woman named Mary Gabriel, and she just chooses 5 artists. And the reason she wrote it was because a lot of the women who participated in the abstract expressionist movement weren't as discussed I guess you could say throughout history is like, you know, everybody knows Jackson Pollock. There are other big names like Robert Motherwell, and just Willem de Kooning, and just other people that sort of made it into history books. And so she tried to highlight these women who were working right alongside these men, and who, you know, they were all just a group of people that just hung out and influenced each other and shared this passion. And so basically when I started working on this collection of paintings, it was earlier this year, and I had just finished another show, and I was trying to figure out, okay, so what works for me, what is the next logical step? And then I found this book, and it just came right on time, I guess. And so I've got these slides here because it's just some samples of their work, and sorry, I don't mean to go through this so quickly. And it's crazy how just looking at a picture of like another artist's studio, like even with this picture, like that's Joan Mitchell, obviously it says it there, and she's just sitting among her paintings, and just looking at that just is the most relatable thing to me. And it's crazy how seeing something like that can be so encouraging when you're trying to do something that you're maybe not really sure about, or don't really feel very brave about or comfortable about doing, and then, you know, trying to share it with other people. I guess I just can't express how much this book meant to me, is what I'm getting at. I'm talking? Okay, so the point that I'm trying to get at is one of the interesting things about that time were just sort of the community of people working together. You know, there were poets, there were artists, philosophers, musicians, and they were all kind of at this point where the war had just happened, World War II had just happened, the bomb had been dropped, and people were at a point where they were like, what the hell are we doing? Like, how can we just paint landscapes? How can we paint portraits of people? Nothing in life makes sense. And so essentially abstract expressionism is just the idea of taking, looking inside yourself and taking inspiration from yourself and putting something new into the world, which to me feels like the most authentic form of creation, because it's kind of, painting is also like a meditative act for me. It's a way that it's the easiest way for me to heal myself through painting and writing usually. I do them in tandem with one another. And I think that's why this resonated so much, because I think the time that we're living in is really not so different from back then. There's chaos everywhere, there's crazy shit in the news every day, and it's like each day you're presented with a new problem, with a new issue, with a new, you know, something that makes you consider your place, at least for me, consider your place in the world and what you're doing and what impact you can have. And so as an artist, that, like, to me that's incredibly overwhelming, just not even as an artist, just as a human. And I don't know what to do with any of it. And so for me, I turned to painting, and I guess I consider it almost a radical act to take time and to reflect and to sort of manage your own emotions, I guess is the best way I know how to say that. Time to pause and get away from sort of that chaos. We live in such a hyper-connected society where, you know, we pick up a device and suddenly we can connect to anyone, anywhere on the planet. And we're constantly hit, again, just with, you know, headline after headline or issue after issue, and I just don't think that's healthy. which I've talked to people about that, and it seems to be like a common idea that, you know, maybe there's a better way to go about things, obviously, and I think using art, creation of any kind. It doesn't have to be painting. You could, you know, it could be making music. It could be writing. It could be just anything. But using that as a way to go back into yourself, connect back with yourself, and kind of just remind yourself of your own humanity, and maybe to consider that there's more to this thing than, you know, problems, societal problems. So, show about nothing was my answer to all of that, because I just think it's just vital to sanity, to personal survival. I think there is the over communication that exists in our society. Sometimes I wonder if it's almost like an epidemic, and I wonder if it's really necessary, or if it's, you know, causing more problems than it is solving them. That could be wrong. It's really just my way of posing a question, I guess. And so I had this idea to not try to explain what it is that I was thinking about when I was making those pieces. Because with abstract art especially, and this is something that was really reaffirmed in the book I read, you know, you go and you have a show and people's first question is, well, what's it about? You know, what is it? Is it a house? Is it a bird? You know, what influenced you? What were you thinking about? What music were you listening to when you painted it? Anything. Just give me something to have a way to connect with it. And so I basically just wanted to ask a question, you know, well, why do I have to do that? Is it possible for you to look at it and connect with it on your own? And my ego isn't so great that I think that everyone would appreciate or love, you know, my work, but it's almost like, are we able to connect to something without having words around it? Are we able to just kind of take a moment and look at it and understand the humanity of it, and that, you know, the fact that I was inspired at all when I made it, could that be enough, basically? And then by that same token, the work isn't asking anything of the viewer either. It's not, you know, trying to advertise anything or sell you on an idea. It's just, here's a piece, please look at it. If you appreciate it, great. If you don't, that's okay too. And I think it's important to have spaces and places where things like that can happen and be okay, where we don't have to have, you know, lengthy conversations, even though I'm talking at length about this, because obviously it means a lot to me, but where we could just, you can just look at a piece of art and just stand there and just be and just appreciate it. I just think that's really powerful, and I think some of these artists that I learned about, you know, they did that, and I just think I wish I had my outline with me, because I had all these great points, but that's essentially what I had to say about it. Just, here's my art, I hope you like it. Or I hope you can appreciate it for what it is. And yeah, I'm not sure what else I have to say there. Does anyone have any questions? This is all very haphazardly thrown together.
What were the other slides you flipped
Oh,
through?
you want to see more slides?
Yeah,
Sure.
you flip through
That's
one.
a great idea. So this is Joan Mitchell, obviously, in her studio. And this is one of her quotes that I really liked. People will never understand what you're doing if they can't feel. All art is abstract, all music is abstract, but it's all real. We're all trying to bring that spirit, that spontaneous energy into our work. Which is true, and I like that a lot. And this is one of her pieces that I really like. And this is Elaine and Willem de Kooning. They were discussed on the book as well, which I will say one interesting thing about that book, it dealt with these 5 female artists, but so much, because it talks about, it's basically a history book, but it talks about their lives and what they went through as women creating in the 50s in New York, and trying to get exposure and sell paintings and be taken seriously as artists. And I just think it's interesting because a lot of the book dealt with their husbands and their partners, which is part of their lives, and it's important, but I just thought that was kind of interesting. Because Willem obviously was an abstract expressionist as well. And Elaine did a lot of portraits, which I thought was really cool. She wasn't strictly, purely abstraction. She had a lot of forms and recognizable images in her work. I like this one though because it's still abstract. Obviously the man's face is kind of blurred. She was more interested in his form and the way he was sitting and that sort of thing, which I think is really beautiful. And that's her husband in his studio later in life. But I showed this to show, they painted these massive paintings, which is another thing that I love. The idea of just like taking a gigantic piece of canvas and putting it on the floor and just working on it has always been a dream of mine. And the biggest painting I've ever made is out there, but it's not nearly as big as anything these people made. One of the painters I really love, who's in the book as well, her name's Helen Frankenthaler, oh, there she is. She had one painting that was, I think, 30 feet tall and like 20 feet wide or something, which is like insane. I tried to find, there's a photo of the group of people that were trying to hang it and how impossible it was, but I couldn't find it. This is one of her pieces that I really like too. She did color field painting, so she would just do large pieces with just huge spaces of just massive color. She was kind of one of the first artists. She kind of helped develop that style of painting. This is one of her quotes. You have to know how to use the accident, how to recognize it, how to control it, and ways to eliminate it so that the whole surface looks felt and born all at once. I really like that quote because so much of it is an accident and so much of it can't be controlled. And I think that's one of my favorite parts of the process because in terms of using painting to learn about myself, it helped me to forgive myself in a lot of ways and to not be a perfectionist about everything I do, because that's not, it's not my style of painting. My style is essentially to make a mess. So in order to make a mess, I have to give myself permission to make a mess and then let that mess be okay to share with people, basically. I guess I just think that, which maybe, I don't know, it's kind of hard to say, but I guess I think that painting abstractly and really throwing everything into what you do and like you feeding off your emotions almost to make it just, sharing work at all is a vulnerable act, but I think sharing abstract work is so vulnerable because of those conversations that you have to have later on where people say, well, what were you feeling when you made it and what motivated it? And I'm a pretty private person, so having a conversation like that is uncomfortable. So yeah, and then this is Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock. then Jackson is obviously, they call him the father of abstract expressionism. I think reading about their marriage in this book was one of the most fascinating parts, because so many people forget about Lee Krasner, but she was an artist in her own right, and before she met Jackson, she actually had a relatively thriving career. She had all of these friends, and she was working for the art project in New York, and making money on her own, and then she met Jackson and just put a lot of her energy into supporting his career and helping get him notoriety and get gallery spaces, because he obviously had his own demons that maybe prevented him from doing some of that. Their marriage is fascinating and kind of scary, but fascinating. And this is an example of one of her paintings, which I really like her work. I know that as far as some people are, like, I've read like art historians that talk about her work, and they say, you know, obviously Jackson was a much stronger painter than her, and I just have never agreed with that. Because I really think that they influenced each other a lot, and it's not really discussed. But anyway, this was actually at the IMA this spring, and this is the picture that I took of it. And then, oh, that's the end. So that's the slideshow. Yay! Yeah, so it was really fun making this work, and it was really, really cool to be able to share it here in this space. And I think it's, there's actually, in one of these paintings out there, it was actually, I was going through old journals when I was trying to put together a slightly more coherent and professional presentation. And I was going through old journals to see what I wrote while I was painting one of those pieces. And one of them, and I don't even remember which one it was now because this was months ago, but I wrote, I painted something today that made me understand why I started doing this to begin with. And it was just like this piece I was really proud of, and I felt like it was the best example of me as an artist to date, basically, and I wrote that. And anyway, so this was a very sentimental body of work for me, so it was really cool to be able to share it. And now I'm finished.